Happy 2023, hybrid shooters. I got a question for you. You know, this channel has been going on for 8 years now. I know, 8 years. A lot's changed. The world of photography and videography have changed. The camera industry have changed. The social media industry have changed. And most importantly, you and I have changed. I used to look at every new lens that come out for Sony E-mount and go, oh my god, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that's because at the time, the lens pool for Sony was very limited. So when Sony or Tamron or Sigma released a new lens for the E-mount, it was very exciting. Making recommendations was incredibly easy. But now there are so many lenses in the market, so much so that I can't even keep track of it all. Sony alone has over 70 plus E-mount lenses, and more third-party lenses are coming out at very competitive prices with decent spec and performance that's honestly good enough for most people. But comparison videos are undoubtedly wildly popular. People love to see how certain cameras and lenses compare to one another, especially against other camera brands. It's almost expected now that a camera tuber compares the latest thing to everything similar in existence, and quite frankly, I can't do that anymore for 2 reasons. Number 1, I'm going to be continuing as a traveling digital nomad for another year, and it's been a challenge for me to get other cameras and lenses for comparison. Usually getting one isn't a problem, but when you're trying to coordinate a shootout, it's a bit tougher. Number 2, but really I'd rather spend my time using the equipment that I have to capture the world that I'm in. After all, that's what cameras and lenses are designed for, right? Which, by the way, small little tease, we have a fun travel photography adventure series coming out in February. It's more than just a vlog. It's a mini episodic documentary of our struggles of getting the best shots during our digital nomad years. And we just wrapped up the first film, 2 more is cooking, and maybe 2 more after that. I don't want to overpromise, but we're very excited to share with you guys our creative story. And that's honestly something that I want to pursue a bit more for 2023, so please forgive me for wanting to do that rather than spending hours pixel peeping to see which lens is sharper or which one has a better autofocus. Now, that's not to say I will no longer take a look at new products anymore. My gas journey isn't quite over yet, and I don't think it ever will. As we continue to change, our needs will change, therefore new gear will take place of the old. Back when I first started the channel, I was on the journey for the best hybrid camera, and I found it in the Sony a7 III and the Sony a1. But now I'm on the journey for the most compact camera setup, yet still attaining the highest imagery and visual quality possible. Sony a7C II, please. 4K 60 with the 4-axis multi-angle screen. Thank you so much. For the past several years, I often lean into form factor the most out of all the talking points in my video, and it just makes sense. I love traveling and I love to capture the location that I'm in the best way possible. And I also want the lightest and highest quality camera possible. But unfortunately, there will always be compromises, whether it's price or just physical or even software limitations. So with that said, I want to approach reviews differently. The route will always be user experience, it always has been, but it'll be more focused on how we can use it for travel. And even if it's something that we can't travel with, but I'm genuinely interested in, then hey, maybe I can still make a fun video around it. But neck-to-neck comparisons, you know, I'll still do them if I genuinely have curiosity around them and have to make my own personal decision about it, but for the most part, I'm gonna leave it to other camera tubers out there who can do a far better job, especially a lot of the upcoming ones who have the genuine excitement for it. Which finally leads me to the question for you. Comment below. Whether you're a longtime viewer or a brand new one, what aspect do you value the most when you watch a camera or a lens review? I'm gonna go ahead and leave that broad and hopefully find some great insights to help shape my future reviews. For my longtime viewers, it's gonna be very interesting to listen to your take because we've been at this for 8 years now, 8 years alone on this channel. What you value before might be very different from what you value now. Anyways, let's go ahead and talk about the brand new Sony 20-70mm f4G. This is a full frame lens and the range on this is incredible. 20 to 70 millimeters. Now I've gotten a chance to try this new lens for a couple of weeks now, but really actually used it on our 3-day trip in Osaka. And I really enjoyed it. It kind of made me wish that Sony released this before our Japan trip, because there were more than several instances that the 20mm on this lens would have came in handy while we were going around capturing the autumn foliage. The shots you're seeing now are from my 24-70 G Master 2, and more often than not, I was shooting f5.6 and beyond, despite having 2.8 at my fingertips. But there were a good amount of times having a bit of extra wiggle room on the wide end on a versatile zoom lens such as this would have been nice. But not a big deal, we had the 14 G Master or some type of wide angle on us anyway. But the extra bit of wiggle room is exactly this, and I found myself often shooting at 20mm a whole lot in both Tokyo and Osaka, whether it's urban landscape, traditional temple structure, or even quirky signages. The 20mm just works. And when I need to punch in and get a tight shot, the 70mm feels familiar. After all, I've been using the 24-70 G Master 2 for the better half of 2022. And there's really nothing quite like this in terms of zoom range, 20 to 70mm on one lens in the market, as far as I know. And the thing that makes me like this lens a little bit more than my 24-70 G Master 2 is the weight. They look nearly identical, about half a pound in difference, but granted, it's a constant f4 lens. And yes, the f4 does leave a lot to be desired. You can still pull off some decent bokeh, but most are gonna be concerned about using it in low light. It may need some extra help, some company, like a couple of extra lightweight primes with fast aperture like f1.8, but of course that will add up in price if you don't already have some primes on standby. This lens alone is $1,099 US, and I would say it's a great beginner's lens if you have the wallet size for it and you're just starting out. It's an incredible versatile zoom lens, and it's a G series lens, so optical quality and performance are gonna be some of the best. Even veterans are gonna see potentials in an f4 zoom lens like this. But if you are on a tighter budget, there are other options which we will talk about later in this video. So let's talk about the focal length, the range. Most commonly, a mid-range zoom lens with this kind of versatility usually starts at either 24 or 28mm. In my reviews for both the Sigma and the Tamron 28-70 or 75, I often said 28mm on a mid-range zoom lens is not wide enough, and most people would agree. Adding 4mm on the wide end makes a bigger difference than it would if you were to add 4mm on the tele end. Now we have 20mm in the mix, and just look at the difference. At each stage, you see less and less of the foreground element. And what's interesting is that the 20mm now makes it feel like the 24mm is not wide enough. Again, just a 4mm difference. In the world of vlogging, vloggers collectively agree that 24mm is not wide enough to fit their entire head into frame, especially when they're hand holding it with a mini tripod at arm's length. And when they turn on active stabilization, it gets worse, because the framing gets cropped in about 10%, effectively making it a 26.4mm lens. But the 20mm is just right. In my ultimate vlogging lens video, I rated the Sony 20mm f1.8G as my #1 recommended vlogging lens, and even if you utilize active stabilization, it'll roughly be a 22mm equivalent. Still, plenty wide enough. But if you only care about the wideness of a lens for vlogging purposes only, with no interest in a short tele zoom, then this 20mm f1.8G is an excellent choice, amongst a few others. But the reason why I love it so much is because the 20mm G Prime is incredibly light, and it has an aperture of f1.8, so it'll be great in low light. Now, coming from a film background, I personally enjoy getting my wide, medium, and close-up detail shots, which is why I love the wideness of this lens combined with the 70mm zoom. The 20-70mm G really shined for me at Super Nintendo World. On this channel, we go to Disneyland quite often to test cameras and lenses because, one, it's a very relatable experience, whether you're a parent taking your kids on vacation or you're on a date with your boyfriend or girlfriend, you want to capture that exciting experience. But I wouldn't say I'm a huge Disney fan. Again, coming from a film background, I just enjoy the dress-up characters walking around, the theater-like set designs, and the special and visual digital practical effects that they put on for the rides and the show to create this illusion, this immersion in the experience. But for the most part, it truly is the best place to test gear out. But being at Super Nintendo World, holy cow, I get it now. I get it now why there are so many die-hard, huge Disney theme park fans. The feeling of seeing your childhood in this massive real-life recreation is an indescribable feeling. I grew up with Nintendo, I play my fair share of Mario, so seeing the Mushroom Kingdom characters and the classic enemies along with the world stage set pieces all around was just wow. And I documented my excitement via a vlog and in a cinematic style, and I feel like you can't really get this amount of depth with just a wide prime or a really short and zoom, not unless you bring another lens or another camera with you, which you can of course, but I really wanted to see what I can do with this one versatile zoom lens, and it covered a lot. Again, I can't emphasize enough how much a 20mm came through. With a range like this lens is stuff made of gimbal dreams. And God knows how much I love my symmetrical push-in shots. Super Nintendo World is actually part of Universal Studios Japan, and going through the warp pipe with a setup like this really makes you feel like you're being transported into the Mushroom Kingdom. I also had an early opportunity to test out the new DJI RS3 Mini that got announced a week before, and these two pair up quite nicely. I balance the lens at 50mm, so I'm able to go back and forth between 20-70mm without stressing the motor too hard. And I have full range of motion without needing to remove the eyepiece. The RS3 Mini handled this quite well, so I can imagine with a bigger gimbal setup, it would be even more flawless. I mean, come on, 20mm for scenic shots like this, and then zooming into about 35-50 for these subject walking shots? Ugh, so good. But overall, to be honest, it's not my favorite gimbal combination, at least not for travel. For professional gigs, sure, I would use this. Back during my wedding days, I primarily used the 24-70 G Master version 1, by the way, on a gimbal because it was just much easier on a wedding day. But for gung-ho, play-as-you-go type of travel that I do with zero planning, it's a pain to carry this thing around all day. Like, you can feel how heavy this top portion of the setup is. Now, don't get me wrong. The gimbal on its own, great. The lens on its own, fantastic. But together wasn't something that I enjoyed using. It just wasn't a fun experience to travel with. But I still love my gimbal shots, so I will be sticking to my 14 G Master on a gimbal simply for those wide push-in shots, and using the zoom lens handheld. And there were a few times during my Osaka trip where I had already put away the gimbal in my backpack, but saw some sick hallway shot and was like, ugh, forget it. I'll just turn on Active Stabilization and just walk with it. And surprisingly, at 20mm with Active Stabilization, hey, not too shabby. You can actually get away with it. If you leave it as is, it kind of has that guerrilla filmmaking style or kind of docu-esque documentary where you're following someone, you know, that handheld roughness that has that raw and authentic feeling. And on top of that, when it's this wide, it's hard to notice the little shake imperfection on the corners. And hey, if it really needs some fixing, Catalyst Brown should be able to take care of it so long as you're using a camera that supports gyro metadata recording, which any Sony cameras that came out in the last 3 years all have and will do by default. By the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but the gyro metadata only gets logged if you're using native Sony lenses, right? It doesn't actually work if you use third-party lenses like a Sigma or Tamron, right? Now let's go ahead and move on to the potential cons of this lens, the shortcomings that I've personally experienced while using it. First off, is it wide enough? You know, I keep fawning over how great the 20 is on the 20-70mm for having the extra wiggle room over the 24 on the 24-70. But yes, certainly there are times where the 20mm also may not feel wide enough. For video shooters in particular, we're shooting at a 16:9 aspect ratio versus the 3:2 photo users can shoot at. So we already lost part of our real estate just from that alone. And speaking of real estate, yeah, that would be one case where I wouldn't use this for real estate videography, as that requires something much wider. And when I was on a gimbal, I do feel like it could have been a little bit wider depending on the situation and the environment, especially here at Dotonbori, a hot spot for street food in Japan with all the neon advertisements, which, oh, by the way, it was such a perfect night. It was raining, there were reflections on the floor. Mwah, absolutely gorgeous, and I really wanted to capture the cityscape with the seas of umbrella. But I was quite shocked how I couldn't get all of the buildings and people walking in one frame. Again, photos, not a problem, but video is when I mainly experience this. Now, I do want to say this feeling is quite rare. You know, the 20-70mm is sufficiently wide enough, and it will do the job if you got a roomy space for it. But if you are looking for an ultra-wide look on a zoom, then you still might want to consider something like a 16-35 or a similar variant. For me, I'm likely going to be sticking to my 24-70 G Master 2, and will be using the 14 G Master and 18 bodice on the gimbal like I normally do. But if I have to use just one lens, keep it on one lens, the 20-70 is excellent. Now, on the opposite spectrum, is it long enough? Some people will compare this to the 24-105 f4 since they both have a hefty amount of zoom range and they're both f4. But of course, the 24-105 has the 105 reach. If you're looking to replace an existing 24-105, then yes, you might feel like something is missing. Otherwise, I personally think 70mm is long enough, and if you have a camera that supports APS-C Super 35 mode, you can get your 105 that way. But if you need it any longer, I mean, at that point, it'd be better to carry a telephoto zoom lens. There were instances where I felt like, hey, maybe I could have been zoomed in a little bit more. You know, it would have been nice for these types of landscape shots, but I don't think it would have solved the problem unless I have a 200mm zoom at the very least. Thankfully, there are some of these all-in-one variant out there, like the Tamron 20-200mm. Granted, you lose out 8mm in wideness, but you gain a whole lot of range. But continuing the trade-off of the Sony 20-70mm G, again, a lot of people will shy away from this lens because it's an f4. Now, f4 is not going to be an issue during daytime or anywhere with ample amount of lighting. In fact, f4 is more than fine. It excels in image quality because you can get a lot in focus. But focus is not the concern. It's the not in focus that most creators are concerned about. More precisely, the areas where the image is out of focus, the bokeh. You can still pull off some decent bokeh by shooting up close, and this lens has decent minimum close focusing distance, and shooting at 50mm or 70mm will yield acceptable bokeh for portraits. But if you're looking for dramatic bokeh, then yeah, even f2.8 lens wouldn't be enough. You'd still want to go for an f1.8 at the very least, and most of those exist in prime lenses only. Low light would be the other concern, largely from having to shoot handheld, whether it's for photos or videos. But if you know your settings well enough, and if you have a tripod for photography, then it shouldn't be a big deal. And by the way, I have videos if you need help mastering low light photography and filmmaking. Go ahead and click up here to queue it up. Now, if you like the concept of this range of this lens, but do feel like the f4 is lacking, then this is gonna be a lens where it's gonna need some company. Something like a 35-1.8, 55-1.8, 85-1.8, for those times you're in low light situations, or simply just need more bokeh. But speaking of low light, for Osaka, I primarily use this lens on the Sony a7S III simply because we have the clean ISO performance to help compensate for the f4. Especially walking around some of the darker areas with no neon signs in Dotonbori, or going through some of the darker attractions in Super Nintendo World, I had no issues. So for a7S III and FX3 users, this lens would be an impeccable combo purely for the versatile range. Autofocus. Alright, so this is when I had the revelation that I should be doing something different for my reviews, and I hope so far it's a good start for this change, but you let me know. But the day we had scheduled to do my standard autofocus test, it was incredibly windy in Tokyo to the point where it could just blow down my tripod setup. I'm trying to film something today and it's windy. This was before we left for our Osaka trip, and I thought about scheduling another day to redo it, but I sort of took the extreme windy day as a universal sign that it's time to move on from my traditional reviews. Unless I notice something super jarring or if it's a third-party lens, otherwise I might just skip it, especially for Sony. I'd rather focus on the other aspects of the review, stuff that is equally, if not more important in making a decision around buying a lens or a camera. The thing is, the autofocus on the Sony is already so good. The 20-70mm is rocking the most recent autofocus tech. It has 2 extreme dynamic linear motor, which I always talk about in a lot of my lens videos. It's this mechanism inside of a lens where instead of rotating elements to achieve focus, Sony's technology thrusts back and forth, and it's a much quicker and more accurate way of keeping a focus on a subject. It can nail 30 frames per second bursts on the A1 and your subject will stay in focus, and it's more impressive when you actually see it with a faster aperture lens. We tested it with the 24-70 G Master 2 and the 20mm f1.8G, and it was just insane to see all the images tack sharp at wide open aperture. Even for video, it can keep up with a moving subject at f1.2 off the 50 G Master. But yeah, like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm gonna leave it to the other creators on this matter. Now, even though I said I won't do pixel peeping comparison with other lenses, I'd still like to bring up some of my opinions comparing it with other lenses. Now, this is hard to do, especially since there aren't another lens quite like this that go from 20-70mm. The best we get is close enough. In a way, the 20-70mm G is the successor to the OG Zeiss 24-70 f4, and the Zeiss version is coming up on a decade old now. Both lenses are nearly identical in weight and size, but even if you don't care about the 20mm on the wide end, just based off on the autofocus technology alone on the new lens, the Zeiss would get smoked. And in another way, the 20-70 G is the successor to the 24-105 G. And even if it isn't, and Sony decides to make a version 2 of the 24-105, I mean, I don't think we will see it for a while, not especially since the 20-70 G is so fresh. But most people will probably prefer having a lens that can shoot a little bit wider as opposed to having a closer reach. The bonus to that is that the 20-70 G is also lighter in comparison. Again, this is a very unique lens, but I think a lot of people are still gonna try to compare this to the new Tamron 20-40mm, mainly because they are both zoom lenses that start at 20mm, and they're both so light. Now, while the Tamron has a shorter range, and that might be a deal breaker to some, a lot of people are going to be focusing on the fact that the Tamron is an f2.8 and it's also $699 USD. But if the reach on the Tamron is a concern, Tamron themselves and Sigma have a 28-70 or 75 f2.8 lens. Now, both are slightly cheaper than the 20-70 f4 and both are at f2.8. So even if Sony's image quality and autofocus accuracy might be better overall, the pricing alone is what makes these 3 other lenses so enticing, and it's gonna make those slight image quality and autofocus accuracy differences negligible. But if you have the keen eye for these things, the 20-70 G might still be worth it to you. But if you care more about the wideness and wanting some flexibility, again, Tamron and Sigma have some ultra-wide short-range zoom lenses readily available. Now, I promise you I don't have any insider information, okay? But come on, it's obvious. This lens is coming out. It's not a matter of if, it's the matter of when. We already have the 24-70 G Master 2. We already have the 70-200 G Master 2, okay? It's gonna come, whether it's gonna come this year or next year, who knows? It remains to be seen, but it's coming. I do want to say that the 16-35 G Master, even though it will be lighter for sure, it's going to be lighter than the original version 1, it might still come out slightly heavier than the 20-70 G. Obviously, it's going to have a way shorter range, but the 16-35 has always been by far the most flexible if we're talking about a short-range ultra-wide zoom lens. So that would likely be the biggest difference between that. If you want the ultra-wide look or do you want a really solid mid-range zoom setup. Also, the 16-35 G Master 2 will likely, the price of it will likely be insane, at least $2 grand and up. So, as you can see, it's quite a hard lens to compare to because it just overlaps with so many other similar lenses. But in my opinion, if I had to categorize this lens, then at the end of the day, it is a very solid, versatile, mid-range zoom lens. So on that note, if you can get over the f4 hurdle, then yes, this This is a phenomenal lens, strictly for that range alone, 20-70mm. And this is going to be especially a great lens for the A7S III and the FX3, where you can let in more light via opening up the aperture, but you have enough clean ISO performance to compensate for it. But if you do a lot of travel vacation photography and you're always in bright lighting conditions, the 20mm on the wide end is just insanely helpful. And honestly, toss in a couple of lightweight primes, something like a 35-1.8 or 55-1.8, and boom, you're set for the night. And if you're vlogging and you're more than just pointing the camera at your face, you're like me, wanting to get the wide, medium, and close-up shots as well, then this is a great all-in-one package. Anyways, if you made it this far, let me know what you think of my new approach to reviews, and if you want to support the channel, you can always do so via a super thanks, or simply stick around and listen to what my sponsor Squarespace has to say. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to create beautiful websites. No coding knowledge whatsoever. Perfect for people like me because I just want to make YouTube videos for you guys and not have to worry about coding my entire website. Simply just select one of their templates to get started. Every aspect is easily customizable with their drag and drop feature. Whether you're in need of a portfolio, an e-commerce store, or even a simple blog, design it with Squarespace. Use my link down below to test it out, and when you're ready to launch your first website or domain, use my code JasonVong to save 10% off. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.